Well, welcome everybody for the 13th. I hope you're not superstitious. The 13th Meetup series, and it's a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Raya Jones from the School of Social Science in the University of Cardiff, Wales. I think we've got to know Raya a little bit. You've attended quite a few of these sessions, haven't you?
Raya? Yeah, less than I wanted to because of the work pressure last semester, but yes, there was for a few of them.
I mean, one of the things we wanted to do in the series is to have people from outside a constructivist framework or a personal construct framework, so that it all adds a bit more spice to our discussions. And I first came across Raya when I was writing the reflexivity chapter in David's and my book. In fact, I thought it was dated 2020, Raya, because you got it published in the Journal of Theory of Social Behavior recently, didn't you? But it goes back to 1997, I think.
Yeah, I think it was when it was 2020, maybe when it was uploaded, although I don't remember uploading exactly.
Oh, I see.
But yeah, no, it was 1997, it was published in that journal.
And it's a very interesting paper. It's entitled The Presence of Self in the Person, Reflexive Positioning and Personal Construct Psychology. And she, like Raya, like myself and Viv, particularly Viv Burr and Elena Pavlovich, Mike Mascolo, a number of us have wanted to try and link up social constructionism with construct theory. And the paper does that in a very interesting way. But I suspect, Raya, that you're also particularly interested in trying to do a similar thing with Jung's psychology.
Yes.
And that's a fascinating thing to be comparing these frameworks. I always think it's very interesting it's always a lot more complex. We tend to get rather sort of flippant about using a single construct to distinguish one framework from another. And of course, whenever you really go into a writer's belief system, you'll find that there's all sorts of different ways in which theories overlap and differ. Anyway, I would like to let Raya get started with a triangulation of ontological positions looking at social constructionism, personal construct theory, and Jung's psychology of archetypes and individuation and those things.
Yeah, let me share the screen to start with. Right, can you see it all right?
Yes.
Very nice.
Okay, let me just arrange it so I can see the screen without too many things on top of it. Okay, so thank you. I'd like to thank Ari especially for inviting me for this series and for this talk. I titled it Triangulating Ontological Positions and the listed theories. My approach, the reason I do it is something like looking at a proverbial elephant. I like all of them for various reasons. I dislike some things or critical about some aspect of them. I think that ultimately these ecologies and all psychologies really are trying to figure out what is this animal, what it means to be human. So my purpose of comparing and contrasting and critiquing one theory through the lens of the other and vice versa is not necessarily to eliminate wrong theories. I don't think any are wrong, completely off the mark, but to look at, to trying to get a bigger picture from through this triangulation. Let's go in the next slide if it moves. I got a problem. Oh, here it is. Okay, so this is the plan for my talk. I'll give you a personal background, why I choose this way in particular. And this will give an introduction to how I got into personal construct theory and moved on to the other two. I'll then look at three ways to compare them. The strategies, the epistemological approaches themselves are already contain a comparison of those frameworks. By far the largest or longest part of this talk is conceptualizing structure and construction. This is looking at the ontologies. Then I'm going to pick up one topic or sub-theme, which are titled Considering the Functions of Images. And this will lead us into an open question I'll set to you, and I'll be interested to find out your responses, whether through breakout room or a kind of a larger plenary. So let's go. Right, how did we get it? Well, how did I get here? My PhD was on perceptions of school among primary school children without behavior problem, emotional behavior difficulties. And at the time that I started it in the late 1980s, PCP was quite a prominent framework. My PhD was sort of linked to educational psychology. So I grounded it in PCP. The conceptual framework was more eclectic, but the methodology was inspired by PCP. I converted the repertory grid procedure to a board game that actually we played with the children, called the school behavior game, moving through like a Monopoly type board by throw of a dice and creating a triadic elicitation. Or I would also had picture-based method and another one, but I'm not here, to talk about my PhD. This is what got me to read Kelly. The road from PCP to social constructionism is a road well traveled, and needless to say, Viv Burr wrote a definitive textbook on social constructionism, and others I followed from kind of through at the time that I was doing my PhD, and also earlier as an undergraduate, John Schotter sort of journey from personal construct to social constructionism. However, right, and the debate is going on whether it's compatible or incompatible, these two perspectives. But it begs the question, when we compare and contrast them, which social constructionism you're talking about? Danziger highlighted, two types, she called them light and dark. The dark one are sort of Foucauldian perspectives. The light one, which is where I tend to sort of look to be more interested in a way, is associated with Romare, with Gergen, and Schotter in his early work, or post personal construct work. Influences depends on who you turn to. Schotter was quoting Bakhtin a lot. Raya is always kind of links to Wittgenstein, and Gergen does his own thing. I highlighted Raya because I have been most interested in his approach, and also is the most radical, is the most his anti-mentalist approach, reject in a way the notion of this kind of private space, inner space that we create by personal construct. The paper to which Ari refers, the 1997 paper of mine, has critiqued Ari's positioning theory through the lens of personal construct theory. So it seemed to me, and I still kind of agree with myself all those years later, that our social constructionism is missing something that personal construct, Kelly in particular, has kind of put his finger on. So that's all I'll say about these varieties. Now, the road that is less, if ever, traveled is from Kelly and Jung. Personal construct sort of community and the Jungian communities and the theories themselves exist in kind of this suspended island, suspended in their own isolation. I don't know of any work, anybody who compared and contrasted or tried to integrate or tried to critique one via the other. I didn't. I wrote about, I critiqued, as I mentioned, social constructionist via PCP. I critiqued Jung via social constructionism and vice versa. That has been the majority of my academic work for about 20 years. I never actually looked at PCP and Jung. So maybe there's a paper waiting to be written. Nevertheless, there's a bridge, a kind of a rickety bridge, linking it in my own personal development as an academic. And this bridge is entirely because of Kelly. He is to blame for my interest in Jung, believe it or not. When I was reading for my PhD, reading Kelly, I came across, as you probably recognize this, it's in his first chapter, the first volume, his argument against the concept of energy as a kind of a prelim to his idea of the person as a system in motion. I highlighted this screenshot of one page, or part of a page, but you could see the recurrences of energy, 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 and it's in the context of a rather derogatory argument against it. It's a sort of cranky concept, is completely inapplicable and unsuitable for psychology. Well, I agreed with him. I thought, I thought that's right, and I kind of wondered why anyone would have ever think of imagining this concept. So, I wanted to look at what the other side have to say, and so I looked for psychoanalytical literature. I didn't know at the time that there was such a big difference between Jung and Freud. Jung conveniently wrote a paper called On Psychic Energy, which was published in 1928. So when I read it, I was rather surprised because the argument that Jung was making, he rejected Freud's concept of the libido for very similar reasons that Kelly did. And this sort of got me interested, first of all, in Jung's actual concept of psychic energy. And it there were some scattered sort of publications over the years. I published, first of all, in Theory and Psychology in 2001, and then in my book in 2007. The last one was in 2018, was a chapter that I was invited to write. So, I think I kind of exhausted what I have to say about the topic, and I won't mention psychic energy anymore in this talk. But this is how I got into Jung. I find some aspect of Jung theory, which I'll kind of mention. You'll see where I'm at as we go along. More fascinating than archetype, for instance. Okay, let's move on. So, 3 ways to compare these 3 theories, depending on which one we're going by. Whose epistemology? Going this way, following Kelly, we'd have triadic elicitation, as in that very simple sort of grid, which I'll continue during the talk. I'll kind of start putting things into it. That's really the way I kind of think, in a way, looking at 3 theories, construct, goal, and so on. You know the drill. following Kelly gives us kind of a very definite triangle. There's Kelly, Jung, Raya with similar, two are similar and different from the others, and you can rotate it and say, and go through it. Going with social constructionist, well, we got options. Gergen identified 3 lines of reasoning in postmodernist critiques of psychology: ideological unmasking, the social analytic. I'll pause a bit for a drop of water, let you read it. And I highlighted literary and rhetorical deconstruction because this is how I usually present my work, you know, looking at how the text of psychology are structured, their implicit metaphors of the mind or the person, and how the narrative sustain certain worldview, to paraphrase Gergen. It's not deconstruction as in the negative sense of demolishing ideologies, but looking at the way, kind of in a Derrida sense, of how the text are constructed. And, okay, so turning to Jung, the other way in every sense of the word. Now there's a caveat that should be put here, because I don't regard myself as Jungian, and Jung, not Jung himself, but the Jungian sort of scholarship does not have a good tradition of critique. It's more, normally, or usually, typically, it's a kind of hermeneutics of faith, restoring a meaning to text so as to hear the message correctly. You know, the hermeneutics originated in Bible studies. So there's work is done is, what did Jung really mean? Did he mean this? Did he mean that? And there are various views about it, but Jung himself is not questioned. Rickerdman, he drew a distinction, he contrasted this with hermeneutic of suspicion, decoding disguised meanings, and Rickerd's examples of Freud, Nietzsche, and Marx. Now, I don't exactly, I would say hermeneutics of skepticism is what I do, somewhere in between. Of course, we're looking to see what each, theorist mean, how we understand it, but not exactly necessarily taking them on face value. So if we look at Jung, at what Jung is saying, if we go from sort of through a Jungian lens, we can look at Jung and Kelly and Raya side by side, but this triangle, anything that we kind of want to see in it will be completely an optical illusion in a way, as I try to convey in this image. And I put a quotation from Jung, his definition of what he called the symbolic attitude, which is only partially justified by the actual behavior of things. And for the rest, he says it's an outcome of something, our own view of the world, which assigns meaning to events. No, he's not talking about critiquing theories. He's talking about the ways that we normally understand our life. Something like on par, compared with Kelly's construing, here it is. So we can compare the symbolic attitude with Kelly's idea of man looking at its world through this template. I'm sure you know Kelly's quotation. Okay, so this is, by the way, this is kind of, it's not an open question I'm going to set you at the end, but it is open to discussion if you want. Our own further investigation is looking at the difference between Jung's symbolic attitudes and Kelly's metaphor of the template. Jung distinguished between two kinds of thinking in a paper, well, originally in around 1910, then it became the first chapter in the Psychology of Unconscious monograph in 1912. At the time, there was a debate among psychiatrists and sort of in Jung and psychoanalysts in Jung's milieu and Freud's milieu about these sort of forms of thinking. And Jung was quite central in that debate. He distinguished between, I'll start from the directed thinking side, which is thinking in words, the reality-oriented. Certainly, thinking in words we can fit Raya social constructionism in general into the idea of language-mediated co-construction of reality. We can even go as far as, as early as George Herbert Mead for that. Kelly's constructive alternativism may not be necessarily thinking in words, but it's also in a way reality-oriented. We put this implicit, tacit sort of template onto reality and trying to make sense of it. Jung contrasted with associative thinking, which is image-based, the fantasizing or dreaming. And this is where the symbolic attitudes come into it. And I'll get back to that side of the chart later on towards the end of this talk. Now we're going into the conceptualization, structure, and construction. The two can't be really separated, as this cartoon of a builder. If you build a house, you got a structure at the end of it, but there is a process of construction. You can't do one without the other. However, theories, different psychologists, psychology of personality, look at different, emphasize different aspects of it. So Jung, as you know, gives us a collective unconscious and its archetype. This is the deep structure of the psyche. Whereas Kelly and Raya and other sort of associated theories look at processes whereby the persons make sense of their experiences. So the construction is at the foreground. I'd like to sort of illustrate a fundamental postulate with this visual metaphor. So this is like mud flat, the tide comes in, you can imagine it poetically as the waves of life, washes over you and creating these grooves in the mud. The next time the waves will come in, they will flow initially into the existing grooves. They may deepen some, may erode some, create new grooves, and so on. So this is kind of a metaphor for the ideas that a person processes are psychologically channelized by the way they anticipate events. I know I don't need to teach you the fundamental postulate. The reason I'm putting it in, because I want to put a different picture to show you, to illustrate Jung's concept of the collective unconscious. So here it is. Now, if you say it's exactly the same picture, it's not a mistake. You'll be technically correct, but the ontologies are very different. Jung is thinking on evolutionary scale. Those grooves that we see are created through in evolutionary times, through sort of millions of years of human evolution, and even going earlier to primate ancestors. So archetypes are those channels. They are forms without content. They're waiting to be filled by life experiences. They are the possibility of a certain type of perception and action. Here's the full quotation, or that paragraph where he says it. And I just highlighted a couple of things. So endless repetition has engraved these experiences into our psychic constitution, you say, and resulting in these forms without content, representing only the possibility of ways of thinking, of experiencing the world. When a situation occurs which corresponds to a given archetype, that archetype becomes activated. And then it goes on to look also at the pathological implication of it, because now the activation of archetypes could be problematic from a clinical point of view. In one of his seminars, Jung gave this metaphor, which is, he drew this picture or presented this picture, which he called the geology of personality. So he likened individuals to volcanic islands. You could see the top of what is marked as A, the top of the island is the individual. Below there's the families, which are visible, you know, that's above the surface. And going down as geological strata, you got clans, nations, largest sort of race, like, you know, primate ancestors and so on. And right at the bottom, there's this mysterious central fire, which erupts and sort of moves right all the way up to the individual. So I don't know, you know, I present it in different contexts, and people, you could either look at it critically or you could be inspired by it. But there's one thing missing in it, and that's this, the relational aspect. The individuals in Jung model is this monadic individual, you know, they're isolated, they're literally sort of islands. And I like to think about people as interconnected networks, relational networks. So this horizontal dimension I find missing in Jung psychology, whereas something, you know, the vertical is perhaps understated in psychologies that focus on the relational side. So I've been presenting Kelly and Jung a sort of black and white distinction. Kelly's focuses on dynamic of construction, Jung on the dynamic structure, but it's very much pre-given. There is, like the yin and yang, there's a bit of the other in each. So in Kelly, we got an a priori structure and principle, the necessity of construct bipolarity. And we can look at it critically. Is it really necessary or not? I originally, in my idea for this talk, I had a whole section on looking at bipolarity, but then I realized that it would be much too long to include. So apologies for that if you're interested in the topic, but that may be another sort of occasion. In Jung, the structure, the archetypal structure is pre-given, but there are nevertheless inevitable construction. There's the formation of the autonomous complexes, which are the constituent of the personal unconscious, and also the persona, the system of adaptation to one's sociocultural milieu, which is constructed on the basis, you know, of like lived experiences. So Jung's and Kelly's models don't really merge into each other. You know, they're always, in my mind, they always remain separate. However, they're both of a kind in the sense that they are premised on the notion that, to quote Allport, personality is the dynamic organization within the individual of those psychosocial systems and so on. And it's also, Allport also says it's an inside structure embedded within and interacting with outside structure, so to speak. This idea of personality as an inside structure has been put under fire by in the rise of social constructionism. So this is a paper by Schotter, which I find, you know, kind of really put it, you know, nicely summarized the idea. And he talks about the social construction of our inner life. Our worlds are co-constructed in momentary encounters between people. And those encounters are language mediated, sort of they happen in discursive or dialogical interaction. So so far we already have one construct, dynamic insight system, both Kelly and Jung, opposed to with the pole of dynamic of social, looking at dynamics of social group and discourse as the source of the self. Also, Kelly and Jung are both represent traditional discourses of personality. To quote Varela and Raya, distinction between these two sort of discourses, or two views or paradigms. The one, the traditional, is committed to the assumption of the primacy of individual being. Human nature is regarded as a biological and lived psychologically, first of all, and therefore become a social. The opposite view, the postmodern or postmodernist discourses of personhood are committed to the assumption of the primacy of social being. Human being is above all, first and foremost, cultural, lived socially, and therefore we have a psychological interior, so to speak. Take it further, although Kelly and Jung both postulate dynamic insight system, they are very different insofar that Kelly talks about construction, the construction of this system, and Jung assume pre-given structure. And Kelly and Raya are similar in the sense that they talk about construction, but they have contrasting views of the construction processes. This is what we will have a look at next. Michael gave, in the first talk, he gave us this diagram, the place of constructivism in PCP. Looking at it, I can't see a place for Jung. I can't drop Jung into any of it. Jung would fit somewhere into the embodied and contextualized, but it's also decontextualized. Well, basically, it's not a constructivist, so we can't put it there. If we wanted to create a space to put Jung here, we'll have to tilt it and create an orthogonal dimension to allow for Jung's geology of personality and going from the collective unconscious to the conscious ego. So here's a more schematic representation. Jung gives us a vertical movement from the collective unconscious through personal unconscious, which kind of overlap construction to the conscious ego. PCP gives us start with the personal relating to others or world via personal construct. The social constructionism begins with the social, and the movement of becoming me within language-mediated social interaction goes, from the public domain into the private domain. So we have a case of alternative constructivism. The pun with constructive alternativism is deliberate. PCP, according to PCP, at least to Kelly, there's a construction of an abstract mental space within which oneself is construed in relation to elements of one's world. Social constructionism, especially in its more radical form of RA, posits co-construction of ways of talking about oneself, discursively positioning oneself within a shared meaning world. What lost in translation, in my view, is the sense, the phenomenological, the immediate, the inarticulate or non-verbal sense in which we experience our world. For instance, if you are afraid of spiders, this, being confronted with something that's looking like a spider or a spider itself is an immediate reaction. Oh, spiders are bad for me. You don't have to think or reason about it or talk about it. When in the move to social constructionism, I found that this element has been, or this aspect of human experience has been lost, right? So we look at how a person may sort of construct their identity as being phobic, and you don't need to have spiders around when you talk about it. But anyway, here's the academic version. So Kelly, I highlighted the kind of conflicting sort of elements. Kelly talked about constructs which are also enable lower animals, constructs which are implicitly acted out, utterly inarticulate and vegetatively sensed. And none of these could apply, could fit into Davis and Harry's insistence that they're only actual conversation and human memories of it and cultural resources and so on for speakers, right, to draw upon. Now going the other way to Jung, we'll kind of discard the animals because Jung looked at humans, and this implicitly acted out, utterly inarticulate and so on, makes itself known symbolically in what he calls associative thinking. So this is where I come back to his distinction between directed thinking and associative thinking. And it gives Jung's used the term symbol and sign in a very definite way, sort of, he has, and he distinguished, he drew a sharp distinction between a sign and a symbol. So a sign is something that's a token for a known thing, it's just a way of representing something. The way I gave you the visual metaphor of the mud flat, to illustrate the theories. We know what it is and we know what we're trying to illustrate. But a symbol is something which is, it's a representation which is the best possible formulation of a relatively unknown thing, which is standing for something that is only divined and not yet clearly conscious. So it could be literally an image, a dream image, or a theme, like a mythological theme, and so on. But it's something which is not, which is something which is reflects something about oneself in a way that inarticulate construct in Kelly theory may. So here we move in to look at considering the functions of images. In the Jungian context, images have a important, a very central clinical relevance. There's Jungian dream interpretation, the patient's dreams, and also analyze their own dreams, sometimes in relation to the patient. Jung's active imagination techniques involve patients, or could be in other contexts, doing something creative, painting usually, or drawing, and you don't have to be an artist for that, but something that kind of means has a meaning to you. And there are other sand play, for instance, techniques which were developed based on Jung, but not by Jung himself, but that's a form of active imagination. So in other words, it's looking at products of the creative imagination, whether it's dreams or in wakefulness, active imagination. But I want to look at an example from Jung's own experiences, just to kind of take this forward into the comparison between the three theories. So Philemon, this character, came to Jung in a dream at some point, and then it became something like an imaginary, like a child's imaginary companion. He drew Philemon in, or painted in the Red Book, which you may know was a portfolio that Jung kept for himself during 1915 to 1930. He never meant it to be published, but it was nevertheless published in 2009. And in this book, he wrote, this folder, he wrote his fantasies and illustrations and so on. Now, Philip, in his autobiography, he tells how Philemon was prominent in his fantasy during his midlife crisis, and he represented a guru-like superior insight. Now, reflecting on it, after a few decades, in his old age, when he was writing or telling his autobiography, he explained this as a personification of his need for guidance at the time. So this image came to him in a dream because he needed this guide, and he kept perpetuating it. He describes how we used to walk down the garden path having conversation with Philemon. So applying Jung's theory will interpret a specific image to uncover its message regarding a subjective situation of the person, the dreamer, in this case, Jung. We could look at various aspects of it. Why does Philemon is looking as this angelic sort of look at it? Why has he got a white beard looking like a wise old man and so on? So, you could take it in that direction. If we apply positioning theory, I can imagine doing a sort of a case study of it in which we would analyze how Jung positioned himself when telling about Philemon. So for instance, his text positioned himself as a patient or someone who had a sort of a midlife crisis. He positioned himself as a disciple, where Philemon is the guru-like mentor. And then as a psychologist, reflecting back, analyzing what it meant to me. But if we do that, the image as such becomes irrelevant. It's just something that meant something to Jung, and we look at what Jung makes of it when he tells about it. Applying PCP, well, I must admit, I'm not sure what would be the purpose of it, but we can identify Jung's implied constructs, for instance, patient versus doctor, disciple guru, and so on. Again, the image as such becomes irrelevant. So here's the last construct that I want to bring in. Kelly and Hare their theories doesn't explain psychological function of images, whereas Jung does. So whether you agree with Jung or not, but at least his theory has got that focus, and it raises question about those products of the creative imagination. Now, although the sort of phrasing a construct in the negative sounds a bit strange, perhaps, absences can be revealing about a text meaning as what is actually said, to sort of paraphrasing Derrida. So I think that's an kind of probably, or to me, it's an important comment about those are the non-Jungian theories. But I may be wrong, right? There's images, right? This is the way I see PCP, but you are the experts on it. So I know that images may be provided towards a listing construct in PCP-inspired research. I did it myself. On the top set of images are some of the images I drew and used in my school of perception story procedure, which was one of the methods I used in my PhD. And it's used, I can say sort of rather proudly that it is being used by some clinician nowadays. At the bottom, you see images that you may recognize. They were used by Viv Bear and Nigel King in their interpretive clustering exercise in this series. So we do that, right? However, is there anything in PCP theory that may shed light on the psychological functions of emotionally loaded images in dreams, artwork, etc., in the way that that Jung does it? And this is my question for you to open discussion. And this is the point which I think looking at the time, I probably met the time requirement, and I can leave it, open it to you now. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Raya. Fascinating. Were you going to want to have a little break before should we do a break and then go into straight?
I can start first because, the
I was just going to say, right, just to, a bit of a flavor of our group was that Ahmed was talking a lot about architecture, which was very interesting.
Oh, okay.
And then Suzanne started talking about using various images in the therapeutic context, I think. mean, I think it's a fascinating question that there has been work about images and pictures in PCP, but it's certainly an area that could be massively elaborated in future.
Mm.
We talked a little about that, Harry, and what I had to say was completely anecdotal. I was wondering, does some obvious references spring to mind about the way in which people construe images?
Is there anything about...
There's Tom Ravenette's work, isn't there, about a drawing and its opposite, which I've always thought has been a brilliant therapeutic technique I used a lot in working with children.
Yeah, there's also Elvira Epraise, I think it was, who did some work using pictures, artist pictures that I think was in the Reading. I think it was in Pam's book from the Reading conference. It may have been Chester, but I have a sneaking feeling it was Reading that Elvira did her work in. But as I say, Dev, it could have been Chester.
Can you remember what was the gist of it?
She basically used pictures, some artist pictures, different artists, different painting styles, different techniques, and used them as the compare and contrast within it, around on there. And Susan Birdie at one of the conferences did a workshop on using the Dixit cards as a way of eliciting, exploring within there. Claudia Gitti and Susan Birdie co-run a workshop at one of the conferences on that one as well.
Someone did that at Edinburgh as well, didn't they? In the marketplace thingy where we all went to different groups. I remember doing that.
They did. I didn't go to that one, Nigel, but they did. And was that, I should know his name. Was that the guy from Edinburgh?
I can't remember.
No.
I don't know. It's all gone.
There was also an Australian lady at one of Gina's weekends that had been doing some work in Australia on using pictures within it, and a guy called Sid Carter at Barcelona. He'd done some work on using pictures and non-verbals because he couldn't go to Barcelona, so Marguerite staffed his poster for him that I remember had Bogart picture on it, so I kept the poster. And he'd use things like sweets as well as part of his exploration work, but lost touch with Sid years ago when he moved down to Portsmouth way.
Has anyone made a link with some of Raya's points about Jung's contribution to Peter?
We had a couple of things came up, which one of which just sort of reflecting on the conversation that just had, which is I'd been struck by the quote the Raya had of the symbol as the best possible formulation of a relatively unknown thing.
Yes, that was very
And one of the things that came up in our conversation was this something about whether the notion of constructs or the notion that you can actually express, I'm putting some of my words on this, that you can actually express a concept through a construct, whether actually privileging that as having a certain thingness about it, which actually, when you think about it, is not that different to a symbol. So that this idea of the symbol as the best possible formulation of a relatively unknown thing perhaps should equally be applied to the constructs that we identify as well. In some ways, they're all symbolic. You know, words and ideas are in many ways also symbolic. And slightly associated with that was, from my own personal side, was a slight disease with this depth view of the psyche between the individual and the underlying sort of geological strata that was in Jung, where I felt that, and we talked about, not surprisingly, we talked about Lacan. I felt that Lacan has a slightly, certainly when you go down in deep depth in Lacan, you don't find archetypes, what you find a different view of the psyche. But I really liked the spider and the phobias thing, Raya, which I thought was a great way of saying, hey, there is something missing here that we lose when we think of constructs. But the core thing was, you know, why do we think of constructs as somehow more thing-like than a symbol? And if they're not more thing-like than a symbol, then maybe all of this is, you know, different ways of trying to formulate something that's actually relatively unknown, inherently always relatively unknown.
I have a problem with this notion of using a symbol to stand for the unknown rather than a construct. If I choose a symbol, truly I'm choosing a particular symbol. I'm choosing a metaphor or a simile. That is a very
David,
choice.
Can I stop you there, because you're it's not right. Perhaps I didn't explain it well. If I use a symbol, like for instance, I gave you that picture of the mud flats again, you know, I know what it is, you know what it is, we know what the fundamental postulate is. This is a metaphor which I specifically chose to say, and that's what we call a symbolic representation, maybe in non-Jungian language. For Jung, that idea of that it's standing for something unknown would be if something like an image came to me in a dream, if I felt compelled to paint it, if looking at something, it has a really strong emotional reaction for no apparent reason. So it's not what the image is, and I would not know what it stands unless I explore it through, you know, Jungian would say through Jungian analysis. But it's so what you're talking about, Devi, is what Jung calls a sign, not a symbol. So it is confusing.
Sorry, Raya. I think I had a similar question in my mind to what Devi's talking about there. And your definition of a symbol from the Jungian perspective was something that isn't quite articulated or isn't quite aware. So one thing I said in our group was a symbol is still a construct with all its underlying symbolism that are just the subconstructs and the subordinate aspects of it within there. But what does a symbol become then once you've articulated it? Because it's still a symbol in my language.
No, it becomes a known thing then. It becomes something,
and symbol.
Maybe you don't need it anymore.
But it still symbolizes the known thing within it as part of that. So I can understand where Devi's coming from, because I think I had similar questions.
Yeah. No, I'm just, at this point, I'm just giving you Jung's definition, and you can sort of look critically at Jung and say that he talked about strict distinction, you know, that's quotation, he actually said strict distinction somewhere. But maybe it's more fuzzy, the line between, you know, symbol and sign, the semiotic and the symbolic is different. By the way, Jung's, you maybe, you know, Kristeva's Le Symbolique and Le Semiotique, and which is the opposite to what Jung called the symbolic and semiotic, just to confuse us even further. But there is, I think, if you ignore the sort of the fuzzy, sort of the blurred line between them, on the one side, you have something which is images that grab us for, or even appear in our mind with no, you know, we don't know why until we sort of start reflecting and interpreting them. There were some things that Peter said, which got me kind of also thinking, and I think it was connecting to what you were going, is the idea of a construct. And a construct itself, the very notion of construction is symbolic. We talk about construction. What is it? It's not, what is the mind? That's where the social constructionism, like how I comes into it. It's got this black box, that's another metaphor, you know. So we talk of construction, of things that happen, that as if we are doing it consciously or unconsciously in our mind. The idea is that we have a construct, the notion of construct, and that construct should be bipolar, or that we have some constructive view of the world in one way or another, is itself a symbolic representation of human experience. That we really is the best way to talk about it for the moment, because, you know, we don't know any better, you know, another way. Sometimes, you know, maybe neuroscience will tell us this is all happening in the brain in this way or that way, you know. Who knows?
I have a comment.
Yeah.
Raya, first, I want to tell you, I really loved this presentation. I thought it was really, really thought-provoking, and I like the juxtaposition of those three people. Thank you. I may not be understanding the question entirely, but my understanding of the question was, can PCP illuminate the psychological functions of emotionally charged images? If that's true, if I understand Jung correctly, that the images have some meat to them, if you will. They have their origins in the depth, in the creative fire. You know, there's some sort of archetype or meaning to them that drives psychological functioning in some way from the bottom up. And it's interesting the way in which the discussion took place, because the PCP people here started immediately to use PCP language to interpret images, if you will.
Yeah.
But it strikes me that that's not an answer to the question yet, if you will, because is there anything in PCP that's like Jung? And I would say no. I would also
I would say no. Yeah.
I would say no, and I would say properly no. I would say properly no. The whole thing kind of rests upon whether or not we think that there's some primordial it, or some collective unconscious, some already specified structure that's driving psychological functioning. And in Kelly, or in constructivism, the answer, I think, is no. Images would just serve any other function as a meaning mediated process.
Can I make a point? I mean, I've for a long time made a distinction between a theory as a picture of reality and a theory as a method. And whilst I think you're right, I mean, PCP and probably social constructionism are deliberately sort of content free, because they're tools for finding out the clinical or whatever domain you're working in, how people are making sense. And PCP seems to me still enormously able to, say, for example, look at the meanings of paintings. You know, when a good art critic talks about what's going on in a painting, I think basically assembling a set of constructs that help them make sense of that painting. Right. So in a way, the two things are doing different things, Jung and the constructivists.
Harry, I worry that maybe you're taking my comments as hostile toward constructivism.
No, I'm not arguing. I'm just adding
because they're not. I think that PCP or constructivist approach to this is exactly the way it kind of ought to be. We're gonna make sense out of the image, rather than the image already has some sense that's already in, you know, underneath there, that drives human functioning. That's what I'm saying. Well,
the image, the painting, for instance, has a painter who painted it, and whether or not their intentions are reflected in the painting, it should throw light on that. And on the dreamer, if you're talking about a dream image.
Just speaking from utter ignorance of Jung and clinical issues, Michael, surely the notion of an archetype is the thing which is driving a implicit meaning before anyone is individually construing it.
Right.
I
guess I'm critical of that. I'm very critical of that idea. I think that's maybe the point.
Well,
thank you, Michael.
Say more.
Someone else can say.
No.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
It looks like one of the differences that comes across to me between Jung and Kelly is that Jung is concentrating on what you think, and Kelly seems more interested in what you do. And if that's the case, but they overlap, obviously, because life is bigger than either of those.
I'm not sure that that's correct about Jung, because Jung, but he's looking at what you do in a simple sense. Active imagination, it's all about doing.
But not doing. But I'm talking about doing out in the world.
Okay, yeah, all right. You could say, you know, Jung is very introvert. Yeah. Yeah.
Because there was something that came up and something I was going through recently where they were talking about where Kelly had asked about whether he was cognitive, whether this was a cognitive approach. And he was arguing, I can't remember what it was now, but he was arguing against that, saying, no, I'm looking at what people do here and taking from that what is implied by that. Whereas Jung starts from a different direction. It seems to me he starts with the individual and the universal properties of individuals, and then works towards human behavior from that.
Yeah, I think Jung, there's too much emphasis on archetypes. So Jung obviously wrote a lot about it. It was his original idea, or, you know, applied in psychology at least. I was saying, I think it was in the breakout room, I did come across references to German thinkers before Jung, who talked about, gave very, very similar concepts. They didn't call it archetypes. And Jung didn't call it archetypes to start with. The term was invented after, or applied rather, after 1912. He called it primal images or primordial images to start with. Now, Jung, so although Jung paid a lot, you know, put a lot into it, when you look at some of the clinical case studies that he was, that he told about, that he wrote about, he was, although he was kind of trying to relate it to archetypes because that was his passion. He started from looking at what the person as the patient is telling and their life situation, looking at the paintings, you know, at what was coming, you know, what was their preoccupation. In a way, I expect, as any psychotherapist would, you know, how else would you do it? He also warned the dream interpretation that sometimes dreams, he got a quotation somewhere, sometimes a snake is only a snake. It's not a mythological, you know, significance of a snake. You got to look at the person's dream in context of the person's life, right? And interpret it in what it means, this dream symbolism means to the person, not, you know, before you go amplifying it with archetypes. So as theory, I agree with Michael about I think you said about the geology, you know, this geology of personalities, because I tend to be, when I saw it, I thought, oh no, you know, and I still sort of have kind of reservations about the whole image. But, you know, that's what Jung sort of was looking at. So it is dependent which level you're looking at what Jung is telling us. And I find him interesting in the level of a kind of a parallel to Kelly's level of theorizing, in the sense of looking at how our mind construct meaning and then communicates the meaning to consciousness. And Jung does the same way, but he looks at images rather than constructs, right? So, and then on that, he adds another layer of, perhaps under it, a layer of depth of saying, but some images got an archetypal origin to them. But then the archetypal origins, I would I tend to be critical of, and most of my work in the kind of publication in the Jungian context, where I mention archetypes, I do have some criticism of it. So I'm kind of glancing at some things come in the chat. There was thing about the bipolarity, and yes, there's Nigel. The parallel between Jung and PCP in both emphasize bipolar opposite, definitely. That was the section, one old section that I took out from this talk because of length, looking at Jung bipolarity in Kelly, sorry, the idea of bipolarity, and Jung's shadow, ego and shadow and animus and so on. These are the main bipolars, but it's bipolar, you know, everything that Jung does is in bipolarity. You got introvert, extrovert, and other sort of the functions of consciousness. Two kinds of thinking, associative and directed thinking, and again, another sort of bipolar construct. So Jung is thinking, is theorizing through constructs, right? The difference in terms of the opposition is that Kelly tells us that, I'm trying to close this so I can see that, Kelly is telling us that we construct these construct systems, you know, it's our own, literally our personal construct. Whereas Jung says that it's already given in the psyche. So for instance, the clearest way to explain it is that what we call attachment theory, security or insecurity. But you know, Jung talk about the mother archetype. So we are evolutionarily predisposed, because we are born helpless, you know, and dependent, to experience being cared for, right? And therefore, there's always the possibility of not being cared for. So there is, you talk about archetypes of the loving and terrible mother. And, you know, sort of, so you always got the opposite. All these archetypes are within, when you look at within themselves, are got two opposites. So for instance, rebirth is a good thing, but also vampires are reborn, you know. And the wise old man, you got this, he talks about the wise old man and, you know, old woman, you know, it's the sort of, the kind of benevolent mentor, but they're also the sinister wise old man, you know, the evil mastermind sort of thing. So it's all, so he gives this thing. I'm just looking at the other, from Seamus, I see differences, but let me open the chat again. I see differences, but don't see mutual contradiction yet. Well, good, that's nice. You know, I would, as I said, I can see all the differences and the incompatibility between what Jung is doing or focusing on and what Kelly does. But my question was an open question, you know, because I think you know Kelly.
Raya, doesn't a link occur between social constructionism and archetypes, in that you could say that myths are highly cultural things? Has anyone written about making that kind of connection?
I'm trying to think. I think the thing with the archetypes and myths, yeah, the cultural things and myths, is if we look at myths from a cultural point of view, or from social constructionist point of view, whatever, you know, anything but non-Jungian, myths are something that is produced by the culture. I think I actually wrote about it in my book about Jung and postmodernism. I got a section on myths, you know,
right.
looking at. So myths are something, and Wundt before Jung, or parallel to Jung, was talking about myth as something that is a cultural product of the culture.
Did you say Wundt? Did you say Wundt?
Yes.
Yeah.
Jung say, yes, of course it's a product of the culture, but it's a product of the culture because it's the archetype is driving the culture to produce it. So I see that quite a few people are got to go because I think we are.
Yeah, we're over time actually, but
yeah.
shouldn't matter too much. Are there any final burning questions that anyone wants to ask before we stop? Well, I'm sure everybody would want to join me in thanking you very much for incredibly interesting presentation, Raya.
Thank you.
And I know it'll go on resonating, and as things do over the next few days, it'll be floating around and raising interesting questions. So thank you very much again.
Thank you again for inviting me and giving me this opportunity.
Real pleasure. Let me just mention that there's one more